Chapter 20, The Annie Easley. In the first half of the 21st century, computers continue to evolve. Algorithms called artificial intelligence learn to recognize people, voices, keyboard patterns, heartbeats, how people walked and what phrases they use, their buying patterns, and their politics. Using a phone was to be a continuous subject of psychometric testing. Companies use this information to sell many products and services folks could do without. Governments bought information from social media and major retailers to construct disinformation and other means of control. It was also much cheaper and simpler than citizen spies and meat-brain enforcers. Not all uses of AI were negative. Machines learned to interpret X-rays, MRIs, and other radiological scans. With vast amounts of data, they became as good or better than many doctors in diagnosis. Autonomous vehicles, especially in air and space travel, were greatly improved along with domestic robots, weather prediction, agriculture, and pest control, to name a few. Manufacturers of many products cheaply and easily gathered data with every unit concerning its use. This information was the property of the manufacturer leveraged to improve new products or those in the field via periodic download. Doctors Cassini and Safford were in her office when she received a call from Dr. Suzuki. "Yes, Kaito, how is your expedition going?" The exobiologist answered, "So far, so good, Colleen. We're making great progress and should be at the crater by tomorrow morning. 2 of our drones are already there. Thank you again for pulling strings at Mitsubishi to get us these crawlers. There's no way a traditional rover could make it through these sand dunes and glacial scree. It takes some getting used to. This is the first time they've ever been deployed on Mars." The director responded, "I've tried to keep up, Kaito. Video of that landscape is really unique. Are there signs of water or other resources we can use?" Dr. Suzuki answered, "We're keeping to a brisk schedule to make the crater as planned, but we've taken samples occasionally where the sand isn't too deep. There's more carbon dioxide than normal, as well as water. We're hoping that indicates frozen CO2 deep down and substantial remains of a glacier. Of course, the crater will tell us more." The day arrived for testing human-rated vehicles at Star Olympus. Tasha, Kayla, and a few other intrepid employees volunteered to be the first. Over the comlink, Oli said, "You've all been through orientation, forward and backwards, so there should be no surprises. The vehicle's AI will do the lion's share of the work." Kayla piped up, I know, but I can still be nervous, can't I?" Tasha kidded, "Yes, you may, but try channeling those powers for good." The long tubular craft accommodated 40 people, but for this flight, only 6 were present. The outside of the vehicle was clad with a sky blue padding for absorbing the energy of micrometeors. The bottom was covered in ceramic tiles for thermal protection. Triple pane Alcon side windows and front canopy were covered during the launch phase. Tasha, in the pilot seat, had camera views inside and outside of the ship in key locations. These included 3 small rear gimbaled engines, attitude control thrusters, plus upper and lower surfaces of each stubby wing. Brandon's voice came over the headphones. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. Tasha's group barely felt the first push, but acceleration increased quickly toward 3 Gs. Via display, she saw herself and all passengers sunk deep in their seats. All views of the Olympus Mons slope were pinkish blur. By the time anyone came to terms with takeoff, their tripled weight became nothing briefly before the main engines fired. Window and canopy covers retracted. Tasha said, "This is Tilly Lewis. Come in." That was pretty smooth, Brandon. She's flying herself. Brandon replied, Roger, Tilly Lewis, you're on nominal trajectory for rendezvous with Annie Easley in 72 minutes, 18 seconds, out. The main engine shut down with the craft reaching orbital velocity. There were only infrequent firings of control thrusters. Tasha said, Okay, everyone, I don't know about you, but it's been some time since I've been weightless. If you'd like to unbuckle and loosen up, go ahead. Kayla no longer looked nervous and was the first to float free. The others followed. With so few people on board, there was plenty of room to play. Brandon broke in. Tasha, a little zero-G fun is all right, but keep your ears open for any warnings. Have everyone strapped in a seat 5 minutes before docking. Out. Tasha thought to herself, as much as I love microgravity and the pressure it takes off my legs, I should be the first one buckled up. She took her position in the pilot's seat once again. Okay, everyone, playtime is over. We're here. The Tilly Lewis parked 100 meters from the docking port with alignment cameras focused on the targets her eyes could not detect. Tasha felt thrusters firing to close the distance. She informed her passengers, the Annie Easley is a massive ship which spends most of her time in orbit about Mars, with occasional trips to Earth or the Moon. She processes dirty, salty ore brought in from Ceres to extract water for splitting into oxygen and hydrogen. Stop, back off to 75 yards, and reload docking sequence. Wait for my orders. Tasha spent 6 months working on an orbital platform above the moon. The bureaucrats were arguing at the time over her clearance and qualifications for Mars. It seemed silly to get so far and not go all the way. Scores of emails flew back and forth while she made herself useful as a tug driver. Almost immediately, she knew that Tilly Lewis was moving too fast. She said, Tilly, the closing rate is too high for correction. Stop, back off to 75 yards, and reload docking sequence. Wait for my orders. She felt thrusters firing as the ship slowed, then backed up. All heard the AI speak while the display lit in green text. Awaiting orders, distance 75 yards. Tasha said, Tilly, reinitiate docking sequence. At this point, the passengers looked a bit frazzled. They had little experience with malfunctioning algorithms. Thrusters fired again, but Tasha sensed the bursts were shorter. The Tilly Lewis moved forward at about 2 meters per second. Nice and easy. Tasha said, That's much better. One thing we know is that the Annie Easley won't be jumping out of the way for us. Kayla gripped Tasha's arm as the two craft locked together. Tasha said, You see, folks? You just have to know how to talk to them. There's the all clear sign. Let's head to the airlock. Crew from the Easley were there to greet the guinea pigs and welcome them aboard. Tasha said, Brandon, you have some tweaking to do on that docking sequence. Other than that, it was smooth sailing. He replied, You're right about that. None of the cargo craft had that problem. I'm guessing it's because your ship was so light. We'll get it, don't worry. The docking ports were spaced along the central core, forward of the main propellant tanks, reactor pods, and engines. Moving farther forward, they passed through an airlock and onto one spoke of the habitat ring. Their hosts moved their luggage to a dumbwaiter built into the wall of the connecting corridor. Following a crew member, Tasha turned 180 degrees and grabbed onto the ladder. All could sense the increasing pull on their bodies. The captain of the vessel, Fritz Hoffman, was at the first ring-level entrance to meet them. Shaking Tasha's hand vigorously, he said, Welcome aboard the Annie Easley. Congratulations on a successful An historic transfer to orbit. She replied, just a few hiccups to work out, but we're glad to be here. Once again, we thank you for helping us with this trial, Captain. Hoffman was grinning from ear to ear. Don't mention it. This will be a game changer. You have no idea how up in arms the fixers on Earth are on this one. It's quite a coup. You're all invited to dine with me at the captain's table this evening. My people will show you to your quarters where you can stow your gear. If any would like to have their flight suits and helmets freshened, just let them know. Hours later, after everyone had settled into quarters, the ship's bell rang for dinner. Tasha and Kayla, along with Chet Dixon and the rest, arrived promptly in the small mess hall reserved for the crew. Captain Hoffman and his first mate were in their formal Ares propellants jumpsuits. The representatives of Star Olympus were also dressed for dinner. Tasha wore a white top, long black skirt, and leggings with discreet artificial muscles. Chet said, it's been a long time since I've experienced a full 1G. I almost forgot what it was like. Kayla said, now there's an interesting idea. We could build hotels in orbit for vacations in Earth gravity. It would be a total switch from those microgravity amusement parks in low Earth orbit. I guess we all crave novelty. Habitat rings aboard the Annie Easily were actually a set of long, concentric tubes where the inner diameter of each formed a ceiling. The floor of one tube transitioned to the ceiling of the next. The processor and transport ship had 5 such levels with 1 rotation rate. Centrifugal force increased toward the outer level, which was 1G, but the radius was such that the differences were slight. The officers' mess was located at the end of level 5, featuring a large observation window. Tasha said, this is so peaceful compared to the last few months below. You have a wonderful view of the surface. Captain Hoffman said, yes, I know what you mean, but when we're underway, we don't have much time to enjoy it. We're doing 105 Earth minutes per orbit right now. We should be entering the night side soon, with a view of the Valles Marineris. It's getting easier to see lights these days, with all the growth. Some of my crew claim they've seen your outposts in the Valley Central. Dinner was served. The first mate, Bruno Cosquella, smiled and said, this is another blessing your services make possible. Most of our meals start as freeze-dried with very little fresh or frozen. It's not that we don't have the space here, but the expense of bringing it from the surface is difficult to justify. With costs going down, we could have more civilized meals. Tasha replied, I hadn't thought of the other needs of space traffic. That's a great way to expand the farming sector. Interplanetary liners should be very interested in frozen shrimp as well as beef, pork, and chicken, plus fruits and vegetables. I hear we'll have strawberries for the first time next year. Captain Hoffman added, with Ares' launch, won't there be competition soon? I believe Dr. Suzuki's expedition to the meteor crater has turned up a good supply of water and carbon dioxide. Solid CO2 is more economical to manage than pulling it from the atmosphere, and there may be a glacier down there. Perhaps the UN will subsidize their own plantations. They're really trying to sell it in the media. Chet said wryly, there are 2 things the UN is good at. The first is making claims and promises. The second is convincing people they said no such thing. Earth schools don't teach children about 40 acres and a mule. Tasha said, Captain, I'm still amazed at how quickly these orbital refining stations came online. It's only been about 20 years since the series mines got going, isn't it? Hoffman replied, most of the technology is adapted to what the folks down there have been doing for much longer. The ores we're working with is easier since water content is higher. Then again, the convoys can only supply so much. Getting water or methane from the surface is going to lower costs. The first mate said, I'd be happy to give you, or any of your group, a tour. You'll recognize most of what you see, but in a slightly different package. Halfway through dessert and coffee, Tasha received a text from Brandon. Chet asked, Why so serious? What's wrong, Nagorski? Tasha frowned. There's a problem with our tracks. We've lost communication between Sutter's Mill and Deadwood. Anofi has frozen all operations until we get it figured out. Captain Hoffman asked, I know you planned on staying a few days, but do you need to get back earlier? Bruno, how quickly will the Tilly Lewis be ready for re-entry? The first mate replied, Cargo ships require at least 4 hours to inspect and top off fuel systems, adjust ballast, and do a final check. The difficulty in docking tells me weight distribution could be tricky, Tasha said. Captain, the Tilly is your ship, or rather Ares Propellant's property. I can't ask you to take that chance. Hoffman replied, I'm authorized to make such decisions based upon both need and risk. She has to return to the surface no matter what. If your engineers are up for it, it's the fastest way for you to deal with your other problems. Tasha huddled with her passengers in conference with Brandon and Ole. Skarsgård said, The problem is the weight. We have a pretty good idea how to adjust it, but we'll need to update the ship's software. Otherwise, you might spend too much time in the upper atmosphere and overheat and or miss the final target by tens of kilometers. We'd rather have you set down on a prepared pad. Tasha said, Sounds like the software is the biggest issue. Up here, they could be ready to release in a few hours. Brandon added, Tash, the last thing we want to do is put you all in danger, but we might need all hands on this one. If some want to wait for a less questionable return flight, it won't be held against them. Tasha responded, Brandon, I have faith in those systems and I'm ready to go. It has to be tested sometime, right? Chet, Kayla, and the others chimed in. We're all ready. Just say the word. As they adjourned the small conference room, Bruno intercepted Tasha. So what's the verdict? She replied, We're all in agreement. We're going. The first mate said, I figured as much, and that's why I began readying her for flight in anticipation. We'll help you get your gear loaded, but do come back when you can stay longer, okay? With everyone buckled in, Tasha received a message from Brandon. Tash, take a look at your navigation log for the latest re-entry program and check some. It should be RE0089. Our AI has confirmed already with Tilly, but we want to be sure. You'll do about 1.5 orbits before re-entry and landing at the Ares Propellants Yards next to Milliken Station. It will be early evening, close to local sunset. Tasha called up the navigation log as she listened. Brandon, confirmed program RE0089. We're T-minus 4 minutes from separation. If there's nothing else, we'll see you on the ground. Over. Brandon replied, Roger that. Over and out. A slight thunk was felt as the docking clamps released. Tasha eyed the view of the receding airlock as the Tilly Lewis slowly retreated into inky blackness. Approximately 200 meters away from the ore and fuel ship, thrusters reoriented the passenger shuttle. The craft fired both main and attitude thrusters in a delicate ballet, choreographed to reduce speed and altitude. Tasha was nervous, though she'd been through the simulator many times. She informed everyone, These ships are meant to be extremely friendly to the most inexperienced space travelers. To reduce G-forces, we'll be air braking longer than most of us are used to. There was little talk as everyone watched their trajectory moving closer to the re-entry point on the built-in viewers. Little by little, the Tilly Lewis began to buck. The density of gas varied in the outer edges of the atmosphere. Tasha, without looking around, said, Make sure those straps are tight, people. Better safe than sorry. The attitude of the vessel nosed up slightly to better protect the Tilly Lewis from hot plasma. The radiant gas was pushed farther from the heat shield by magnetic field generators. Kayla once again gripped Tasha's arm. She said, "Tasha, are we overshooting? We don't seem to be descending fast enough." Tasha knew Kayla was right. She just hadn't admitted it to herself. She said, "Tilly, our tangential velocity is too high. Are we going to make Millikan Station? Can you compensate?" The AI said, "The current algorithm places us approximately 20 kilometers east of Millikan Station." Tasha frantically thought of how to save the situation, then asked, "Tilly, how soon before we could pop the emergency parachutes?" The computer answered, "The parachute may be deployed safely in T-minus 1 minute, 35 seconds. Tasha thought to herself, this might just work out. Doing some rough figures in her head, Tasha asked, "Tilly, calculate touchdown parameters for parachute deceleration, followed by landing at Millikan Station. Ares propellants compound." After 10 seconds, the computer said, "Trajectory calculated. Must initialize in T-minus 37 seconds. Reference sequence RE0090. Tasha said, "Show sequence RE0090 on screen." Mumbling to herself, she said, yeah, that looks right. Okay, Tilly. Enable sequence RE0090 on schedule." A countdown clock appeared on all viewers. With everyone in pressure suits, Tasha couldn't gauge their body language. Kayla tightened her grip on Tasha's arm before saying, "Tasha, look at the internal temperature. Isn't it a bit high?" The temperature inside the cabin was increasing. 97 degrees, 98 degrees, 99 degrees, 100 degrees Fahrenheit. She said, "Everyone, it's going to get a little warm, past full compensation of your pressure suits, but keep your helmets on. After the braking chute is deployed, the temperature should drop." At T-minus 10 seconds, the cabin temperature was 122 degrees Fahrenheit and rising. Passengers started to squirm in their suits. Tasha noticed hers was at 106 degrees Fahrenheit, but most importantly, the hull temperature was at a dangerous level. Tasha said, "Tilly, adjust power to the plasma shields to 108%. The AI answered, "Power available for shields at present is 104% maximum. Increasing now." Internal and external temperatures for the Tilly Lewis slowed slightly, but kept moving upward. The countdown read 4, 3, 2, 1. At T equal to 0, the ship was yanked upward with considerable force. Internal and external temperatures both held, then gradually dropped. Even with the parachute, they were falling at supersonic speed. Protective shields over the windows retracted, and everyone had a view of sorts. With thrusters and flaps, avionics attempted to orient the craft. Below, the Valles Marineris was moving both into the night side and considerably closer. Brandon, Ole, and Liling tracked the shuttle's re-entry from Millikan Station and could just make out the parachute before it detached. Tasha realized all control belonged to the ship's computers. There was no way any person could intervene at this point. The south rim of the valley loomed very close to their projected path. Seconds later, everyone felt a kick as the main engines fired ever so briefly. Then shortly before reaching the pad at Millikan Station, thrusters slowed the ship as they landed tail end first, 20 meters outside of the pad. Tenders soon raced out to lower the craft horizontally onto a carrier. Tasha said, "Okay, everyone, stay in your seats until we get this girl into the hangar." Ole and Brandon, inside the airlock, brimmed with questions. Tasha told her passengers, "Okay, everyone, go ahead and change out of your pressure suits. We'll meet up in the commissary in half an hour." Once they were gone, Brandon said, "Ole and I thought you were going to hit the rim of the canyon. Why didn't you?" Tasha replied, smiling, "Well, don't sound so disappointed there, Olson." Ole said, "You know what we mean, Tasha. That couldn't have been part of the normal flight plan." Tasha said, "All I could say is it was a good thing they topped off everything before re-entry. That's both main engine and thruster propellant. If it hadn't been for that big kick, we would have been toast. Fortunately, we had enough fuel to both avoid the rim and stick the landing." Ole responded, "This doesn't sound like anything that can't be fixed. The Boring Company engineers will be all over this ship by tomorrow. They'll figure it out." Brandon said, "In the meantime, we have a bigger issue. I sent a team of troubleshooters to assess the situation." Ole was already helping Tash out of her suit, noting how the inside and her jumpsuit were both soaked. Chapter 21. The Robber Barons. Brandon said, "They haven't arrived at the break, but we have drone records." Tasha said, "Hook up to the viewer in the locker room. I've got to get washed up, or I'll be offending myself along with everyone else." Tasha stripped out of her sweat-soaked jumpsuit and hung it in the refresher where any offending agents would be broken down or neutralized while she took a shower. "Okay, Brandon, let me see." As she soaked up and began washing her hair, the first video appeared. The drone was following the tracks about 50 yards below. They did not disappear, but were mangled, almost beyond recognition. Sections were strewn along both sides of the right-of-way to the tune of 4 or 5 lengths. The remains of at least 4 cars were overturned and busted open. Tasha couldn't believe what she was seeing. "So sabotage now, Brandon? Is that where we're at? What is that spilling out of those cars?" Brandon said, "So far, sabotage is what it looks like. When we get boots on the ground, we'll know more." That was a consignment of girders from Damascus Steelworks. They were to be part of a new ship being assembled in orbit. Tasha wasted little time in drying and dressing. She quickly ran a comb through her hair and blow-dried it halfway before tying it up. She readjusted her coveralls for the Mars-Earth gravity difference before meeting Brandon and Ole in the corridor. She asked, "How long before the first team arrives, and do they need any help?" As they started toward the commissary, Ole said, "They should be on site in 4 hours. Heavier equipment is waiting once they've gone over the ground thoroughly. We don't want to be tromping around destroying evidence. Once they're done, security will label all debris for shipment back here for further analysis." They met up with the rest of the Tilly Lewis passengers. Tasha said, "Coffee, anyone? I'm buying." All who wanted coffee, tea, or other indicated their order in the tabletop menu and assigned it to Tasha Nagorski. At the same time, Brandon displayed the drone footage for all to see. The robot arrived with all selections expertly balanced on one tray. Kayla said, "Holy crap, the tracks and those cars are just obliterated." Ole followed. "One thing's for sure, that's not normal, and it's certainly no accident. If there was a derailment, those cars would be closer together and not strewn about." Chet followed. "Right, there's no seismic shifting of the roadbed or lava tubes. Pre-construction surveyed the entire stretch for faults or weaknesses." Brandon slowed the video, then started over from the beginning. Tasha asked, "Did you see something? What are you looking for?" Brandon was silent for several seconds, then asked, "Tasha, what do you see? You've been out along much of the track. What doesn't belong?" Looking for patterns, she then said, "Brandon, can you back it up a few frames? There, look here, here, and here. You see those small craters and how evenly they're spaced? Unless I'm imagining things, that's precisely where the ties are anchored to the roadbed." Brandon called up a measurement tool and took readings between the craters. Then he advanced the video to where the tracks were intact. Track ties with roadbed anchors were slightly wider than those in between, with their ends marked in yellow. He measured the spacing, and the numbers were the same. Tasha said, "I'm only speculating, but it looks like explosives. It's too regular with respect to those craters and random where the cars are concerned. Maybe they were blown for good measure." Kayla said, "I would agree, but we can't make accusations till we find evidence of a bomb or bombs." Chet agreed. I'm inclined to say there were explosives based on the video. The fact that it's so far away from any terminal or sighting is very convenient. Brandon added, we know it's not collision because all those cars were together in one train and nothing behind it. Kayla asked, who could possibly want to do this? It's so senseless and stupid. Tasha said, it could be anyone, Kayla. Mars, to some folks, may be the Wild West in one respect. In the 19th century, the U.S. voted subsidies to scores of railroad lines, so everybody and his brother wanted to be a big shot. Competition was fierce, and along with mismanagement, drove out even those with special treatment from Congress. In some cases, thugs from one company would dynamite tracks or bridges of a rival. Then there was J.D. Rockefeller, who controlled the railroads transporting his oil. He blew up pipelines of those bypassing the inefficient shipping in barrels. He and Carnegie stole innovations dreamt up by smaller players, and the courts let it go. Ole mused, some things don't seem to change. The robber barons didn't go away. They just morphed into something else. Philo T. Farnsworth fought his whole life to be recognized as the inventor of television. The United States, a century later, pushed a phony plague and phony vaccines, bogus climate science with equally bogus solutions, then blew up a Russian gas pipeline. Brandon remarked, you're both right, but let's concentrate on the here and now. We'll get to the how and hopefully the whom. Then we'll take steps. If we find it's the UN or one of their crony contractors, their courts are worthless. Arbitration is only an option if we catch them here. Anyone with new intelligence, please let Tasha and me, Ole or Anofe, know when you find something. Over the next several days, debris, large and small, was brought in by the security firm Durga Associates. Tasha said to Brandon, they're finding residues of potassium perchlorate and a powerful explosive called Sekhmet. Are we using anything like that? He replied, that would have been nice, but the earth vendors we approached weren't friendly, talking about all kinds of export controls, etc. Most of our explosives are made on the frontier with some components shipped from the free cities on Earth. Tasha asked, what about detonators, timers, or control electronics? Anything there? Unless we find a smoking gun, everyone will call it a malfunction or derailment. Brandon said, you're right about that, Tash. We've been careful to stay out of Durga's way while they gather evidence, but I'll ask if they have objections to releasing some early video. We're all of the opinion we were sabotaged, but need to gather allies. Others will see the signs, and it might rattle a few cages. Earth interests recognized an opportunity when they saw one. The UN Secretary General remarked, this is what happens when there is no oversight in such grand schemes. Safety protocols are ignored or non-existent, putting lives and property at risk. We are fortunate this time that no colonists were injured or killed, Dr. Safford commented. We've offered several times to be of assistance in this manner and were repeatedly rebuffed. MUNIS has a large team of scientists and engineers willing to lend their expertise in this investigation. Tasha asked for an opportunity to inspect the damage before repairs began. On the way out, she said, Durga Associates stepped up security in the Star Olympus yards adjacent to Millikan Station. Surveillance video from weeks prior to the incident are funneling through their AI. The aim is to spot suspicious activity or matches to known offenders. With everyone in pressure suits, positive identification won't be easy. Brandon responded, camera coverage is pretty good and there are people moving about almost all hours. I'm glad we have computers for that stuff. The train came to a stop at the last operating section. As they were putting on their suits, Brandon asked, what do you think you'll find out here, Tash? Durga is a pretty good outfit. I doubt they'd miss anything. She answered, I'm not sure what I'm looking for, except nothing about the forensics is definitive, other than there being explosives. There were pieces of circuit board, but nothing stands out. With a collection overlay map supplied by Durga, Tasha and Brandon methodically revisited each spot where evidence was found. Brandon softly reminded Tasha, we can't spend an excessive amount of time on this. You know, we need to get the line up and running. so we can resume business. Tasha said, I know, Brandon. I don't want to beat a dead horse. I think this one has some life in it still. Who uses SecMet? Do we? Is Ares Launch using it? Maybe miners? Brandon replied, we don't use it. It's a brand name made in Austria, and they're pretty strict on exports. I doubt if any frontier miners have it for the same reason. It's usually military, but the UN, in their haste, might have brought it to speed their progress. Tasha responded, is the saboteur sending us a message? Why else would they use explosives we have no access to? Brandon caught sight of a glint of something in the rocks, scraped off to level the roadbed. He walked out about 15 meters, then backed up a few times to catch the correct angle from the sun. Tasha asked, you found something? Brandon was lost in thought as he bent down to look at this new evidence. Carefully, he captured images of it as it lay, then placed his viewer over the top to log the exact position. He replied, it's part of a circuit board, but with components I'm not familiar with. The package is broken, but the chips on board appear to be intact. Tasha said, I hate to say this, but if you found something after 45 minutes, maybe Durga should do another sweep for good measure. In the meantime, let's bag and tag that gizmo and try to find out what it is. Brandon agreed. You have a point there, Tosh. If we can track down the bomb maker, we're halfway home. The next morning, Tasha and Brandon took their evidence to Durga Associates and met with their agent, Pierre Damas. He said, come with me and we'll show it to our chief forensics electrical engineer. Everyone changed into bunny suits to enter the laboratory and clean room. Pierre introduced them. Ichabod, this is Tasha Nagorski and Brandon Olson. They have some electronics from the scene of what we're assuming is a bombing. The older gentleman took the bag from Brandon and dutifully recorded the tag information into the database. Carefully removing it, he placed the PCB under a microscope. He took several pictures of the board with many close-ups before removing it. Ichabod said, this is most unusual, but I need to run an internal scan to see what we're dealing with. Brandon recognized the machine Ichabod was using. It was a powerful structural probe of PCBs and integrated circuits, where the distinctions were blurred. Scanning through the PCB went rather quickly, but slowed in the higher resolution chips soldered face down on the board. Though Ichabod had been a chip designer for years, he appeared to be intrigued. Interesting, this chip here is silicon and those two are germanium. The three there are graphene on diamond. What's more, none of them are off the shelf. They're DIY or made by a specialty outfit, running only prototypes. This board is either doing something very sophisticated or someone needs to hide their tracks. Our AIs can work through the circuit diagram and ascertain its function, but it will take a few days. Leaving the Durga facilities, Tasha remarked, what do you think, Brandon? It was a sophisticated attack with solid resources behind it. I can't think of any frontier interests Star Olympus might be treading on. Everything points to the UN or their contractors, who have the most to lose. Even if we find who planted the bomb, he or she will be an expendable patsy. Brandon responded, that's all well and good, but we've received no ultimatum. We'll be delayed, but by no means are we out of action. It doesn't make any sense. A couple of days later, Durga Associates finished another evidence sweep and repairs were underway. Tasha was at Dodge City North, building toward Valles Marineris. In video conference with Brandon, she said, speaking of things not making sense, have you been following the value of Kelly today? Brandon replied, well, I haven't since we've been hip deep in repairs. He called up the Star Olympus shares/currency on his viewer. Tasha said, set history for 2 weeks before the bombing to today. She called up another company history on her own viewer and continued. This is a chart for Apex Rare Earth. That big dip in the middle is right after their primary shaft caved in. You see how long it takes before the price comes back? Now look at Star Olympus or QLI. Brandon examined both charts closely. Interesting, Apex dropped by over 50%, but we're down less than 10%. Looks like we never lost more than 25%. Tasha said, whoever was behind the bombing or knew about it could profit by selling short and then buying back as it came up. The analysts gave us nothing but praise at that point. With prior knowledge, you'd have to accumulate shares as quickly as possible on the dip without alerting the market. Brandon said, good eye there, Tash. I guess you've been following Frontier shares for a while now. You see here, there's even a general rise in QLI prior to the bombing, as if accumulation had already begun. Taking a brush from a pocket of her coveralls, Tasha started on her hair. I'm thinking of cutting some of this off. It would be less hassle with the helmets, since I'm spending so much time outside. Brandon said, maybe it's because I'm a man, but I like your hair longer. Then again, that's a lot of maintenance. As for your observation of the stock, you should pass that along to Durga and Anofi in case they hadn't thought of it. It sounds like a secondary motive or opportunism at best, but if it leads to a warm body, it should be checked out. Chapter 22. In for a penny. Currency trading was a lucrative gig for Thomas Safford. Newcomers knew little about it. Most people from Earth were not seasoned in the practice. Such was reserved for big banks and the very wealthy who never gambled. The Mars frontier and free cities of Luna and Earth were a different story. Precious metals, cryptocurrencies, and stocks were the primary means of doing business. Anything of value traded on the frontier was in the blockchain. No cabal determined what currencies were worth. Markets weren't skewed by inside trading and legislation. Newcomers were surprised to discover frontier currencies, by virtue of competition, were far less volatile than dollars, euros, or yuan. With so little financial education provided in the schools or media, those paid with UN or national currencies relied on Thomas to educate them as they tried to stretch their stipends. He did help them, but he also helped himself. Thomas sat in his favorite booth at Mark Watney's, enjoying a single malt scotch imported from Earth. A large shadow appeared over his table as he looked up to see one of his henchmen, Afu Tuala. Tuala said, Mr. Safford, Heinrich is here to see you again. Annoyed by the interruption, but continually looking for information, he said, very well, Afu, send him over. Through the grapevine, Safford knew Heinrich had been cleaned out at a poker game 2 nights ago. Thomas had a good idea what he wanted. Mr. Schweitzer, what can I do for you today? Heinrich was wearing Star Olympus coveralls and supplied Safford with bits and pieces of information, but nothing of great importance as yet. As if on cue, Heinrich said, well, sir, I'm a bit low on funds right now, and payday isn't for another week. I'm wondering if you could float me a loan. Perhaps because he'd been in the same situation or had a soft spot today, Thomas asked, how much do you need? You've never asked me for a loan before. Aren't they paying enough at Olympus? Heinrich said, well, yes and no. I mean, the money isn't bad, but I also took a lot of compensation in shares. Heinrich showed him his viewer and said, I need this amount in Monero, and I'll just make it. Thomas said, I'm guessing you have much more in stocks, right? Heinrich didn't know where this was going, but nodded. Yes, but Thomas cut him off. Heinrich, you know what my rates are, yet you came to me anyway. Perhaps I can spare you the headache this time. Here's my proposal. How about you transfer this amount in Olympus shares to me, and in return, I'll give you that plus 30% in Monero. Sound like a deal? Afu Tuala was sitting at another table, but within earshot. He got up, walked over, and refreshed Thomas' scotch. The fresh Star Olympus employee didn't want to give up any shares. He was aware of Tuala's reputation where loans were concerned. It came up in the poker game 2 nights ago. Gulping at his own beer, Schweitzer said, "That sounds like a hell of a deal, Mr. Safford." Taking another sip of scotch, Thomas tapped the transaction into his viewer. Heinrich took out his to confirm while standing up to leave. Thomas noted, "These terms are very generous. Perhaps you could do me a favor one day." Heinrich did his best impression of a smile and said, "You mean another favor?" Realizing he might have spoken out of turn, he flashed a nervous thumbs up as he quickly exited. Once Schweitzer was gone, Thomas said, "Afu, let's keep an eye on that one. I have a feeling he's going to be very useful to us in the future." Afu asked, "Do you need a tail on him, boss?" Thomas answered, "No, that's a bit extreme. Just keep tabs on him through our usual sources. Let me know if he's losing a grip on that gambling bug." Tasha and Oli were at the Boring Company yards, discussing the Tilly Lewis flight anomalies with the design team. Ole said, "The controller AI has the Aristarchus flight logs loaded and mapped into our database. Actually, that is our database for the time being. As Tasha suggested, we'll do flight tests with different loading profiles to get the shuttles dialed in." Tasha warmed her hands on that first 20-ounce coffee for the morning when she caught an unexpected sight. The conference room was above ground in close proximity with the assembly buildings and transport rails. As a maglev flat car floated toward a hangar, she asked, "Hey, isn't that one of Brandon's or Dr. Suzuki's spiders? What's it doing here?" Boring Company aerospace engineer Belinda Goldstone answered, "If you look closely, you'll see they've bent the hell out of two front legs. They're claiming it's a bug in the tactile feedback sensors. Anyway, they realized we were the best qualified to diagnose, repair, and return it before the end of their expedition. We were closest since we manufacture a competing product used for deep sea mining operations. MUNIS even agreed to pay us with something resembling money." Tasha asked, "Does anyone here have first-hand knowledge of them?" Belinda sighed. "That's the thing, we really don't, not on Mars. We can bring it up to specification, but if they pull some bonehead stunt in the field, there's not much we can do to prevent it." Knowing she'd regret keeping silent, Tasha said, "One of our co-workers, Brandon Olson, drove and repaired a lunar version. Though he's vital for our operations, he could possibly help. I can't speak for him or the company, but thought you should know." Oli nodded in agreement. Belinda said, "That's good to know. We'll run through the obvious checks and only contact you if we're stumped." Dr. Suzuki, giddy over discoveries made thus far in the Noctis Labyrinthus, was annoyed by the loss of the crawler. Frustrated, he said, "We've lost a day and a half unloading equipment and supplies. There's a lot on our plate to do, so we'll just have to prioritize." His colleague, Dr. Afram Ofori, was a cautious man. It had saved him at least twice from inclusion on a tainted publication. He'd weighed the positive and negative aspects of coming on this trip, since everyone's name would appear on at least the first paper. He replied, "I would agree, so this time, let's not get careless trying to squeeze in priority items." Ofori was a geologist and an aerologist, to be perfectly correct. He spent the last 14 years studying glacial and rock formations on Mars. He informed Suzuki, "I believe we've done all we can in rearranging our supplies. Unless there's something else, I'd like to get back to our survey." Suzuki said, "Yes, Afram, by all means. I'll be very interested in what your team comes up with." Below the shallow dunes, the crater had revealed a large body composed of water and carbon dioxide ice, but not more than 100 meters thick. "We'll finish this sounding by morning if depth estimates continue on a downward trend. We're close to the front of a glacier, but nothing resembling my experience at the poles." 4 days later, data confirmed that the meteor had hit a buried Martian glacier. Two crawlers with reactors and the highest power removed sand along a 10-meter wide, 500-meter long path upstream. Ofori's team were doing depth soundings along its length. The scientist appeared on Suzuki's visor and said, "Dr. Suzuki, the depth is increasing the farther west we go, and so is our elevation. This could be a tremendous resource." Inside his pressure suit, it was easier for Suzuki to mask his impatience. "Afram, if I understand correctly, your sounding rig has a rather limited horizontal resolution. We need a more complete picture than gravimeters and soundings." Dr. Ofori guessed where Suzuki was going. What's more, he'd likely planned it ahead of time. "Kaito, it's neither necessary nor wise to use higher energies. We need to err on the side of caution." Suzuki would not be dismissed so easily. "Afram, your team could spend the next month at this pace, and where would you be? There's a lot more we could accomplish in that time. We have enough charges and geophones to map the entire area in a day or two." The aerologist sighed. "If we go that route, Kaito, I'll need everyone off this thing. We know nothing about its stability. It's all hands and equipment south by at least 2 kilometers." Researchers were told of the plan that evening and advised to remove instrumentation they might be worried about. Several were wary, but for the sake of their careers said nothing. They wanted their names on those first papers. The next morning, Dr. Ofori's team began drilling holes, planting charges, setting up geophones and seismometers, while others evacuated. After 2 days, Ofori's team was ready for the first test. Dr. Suzuki sent up drones to record the areas in question. He said, "We're ready when you are, Dr. Afram." The response everyone heard was, "Fire in the hole. 4, 3, 2, 1. Now." The charge was deep. The only visual sign was a spray of water and CO2 vapor some 50 meters into the dry atmosphere. Dr. Suzuki, outside in a pressure suit, felt the vibration through his boots. Over the comms, Dr. Ofori sounded pleased. "All geophones are recording. It looks like a good shot." Throughout the day, several more tests were done. After each shot, raw data was beamed back to MUNIS for processing by the more powerful station AI. That evening, Dr. Suzuki chided the geologist. "You see, Afram, nothing terrible has happened, and we've saved an enormous amount of time. I know you were worried, but you have to admit I was right." A smile was the closest thing to an admission Dr. Ofori was willing to offer. He answered, "Kaito, I am pleased, but reserve the right to remain cautious. We're recording a high number of aftershocks, requiring further interpretation. Other than these meteor strikes and mild quakes, Mars has been relatively undisturbed for billions of years. We still don't understand how this planet relieves the inner stress on that timescale." To no one in particular, Brandon said, "They're certainly not sparing any expense." As much as he was disliked in some sectors, at least his talents were being recognized by MUNIS. Too bad they couldn't admit it from the start, he thought. Slowly but surely, Olson was drawn into helping the Boring Company with the repair and testing of his long-lost Spider. As a show of goodwill, Star Olympus loaned him out until the vehicle was recertified. Sojourner 2, as this vehicle was christened, made its way west on the existing Ares launch tracks. She then traveled cross-country solo with a crew Brandon trained in her operation. Brandon brought Tasha with him to deliver the vehicle. On the overland trek, Brandon continuously monitored and tweaked Sojourner 2's machine learning routines. He stored the route taken, and the AI created many subroutines to deal with various obstacles. The afternoon sun shone brightly on newly uncovered, rapidly sublimating patches where sand had been cleared. Arriving at the glacier, Olson said, "Looks like a beehive of activity out there. I hope they're accomplishing something worthwhile." His MUNIS crew, including Riley, had acclimated to advanced sarcasm by this stage. Riley asked, "Hey, Brandon, why are those rigs using wheels? It looks like they only use legs to step over rocks or scramble over sand." Brandon said, "I see what you mean. They must have spooked themselves by banging this one up. I don't think anyone out here has ever driven one of these things, at least not on Mars. How are the AIs supposed to adapt with no experience? Most of the expedition had returned to the crater, with a few branching beyond to gather ejecta samples or drill new cores for comparison. Brandon announced, Dr. Suzuki, this is Brandon Olson and Tasha Nagorski, with the MUNIS crew returning to Sojourner 2. She's fully checked out. Over. Just then, a yellow alert appeared on Olson's viewer. Caution, seismic activity detected. Please stand by. In response, he had the crawler employ drill anchors at every other footpad. Gain was increased for tactile sensors and accelerometers. If there was still or ever had been a bug in the software, Brandon wanted a record. He told Tasha and the rest of the crew, we're the only ones out here on all 8 legs. We're going to be more sensitive to movement. It's the best way to go if we're mucking about on a glacier. Brandon asked Riley to take the Sojourner 2 closer to Dr. Suzuki's spider, to William Gates. His habitat and lab modules were inflated for encampment. Riley parked the spider at a respectable distance from the gates, then anchored her to the ice. As they changed into pressure suits, a high-frequency shock made its way through the legs and cavern. Helmet and crawler displays went to red with klaxon sounding. Emergency, large seismic event. Repeat, large seismic event. Initial estimate, 6.2 Richter scale. Location, 2.1 kilometers north, 55 degrees, 32 minutes west. After the Sojourner 2's AI made a standard diagnostic sweep, their transponder broadcast an all's well to those in the immediate area and any satellites in range. Brandon asked, is everyone all right? Cabin pressure still looks good, but keep your helmets on in case anything pops open. Riley was reviewing all the transponder data. She said, at least the other crawlers are in good condition. They probably absorbed it better on wheels, but that won't stop them from sliding. Brandon went on to the common channel. Dr. Suzuki, this is Brandon Olson aboard the Sojourner 2. Is everyone in your party all right? We're shook up, but everything is under control. The scientist returned. Yes, Mr. Olson. All parties are safe and sound. A couple of habitat modules broke loose from their moorings. I'll contact you as soon as damage control has reported in. Chapter 23. Shake, Rattle, and Roll. Brandon and Tasha stepped out of the airlock at the rear of the vehicle and descended the port access ladder to the ground. Tasha walked over the dusty terrain around the spider, doing a visual check. She looked for any changes after the last 30-kilometer leg of their trip. Dr. Suzuki was supervising as his people re-anchored the laboratory module attached to their crawler. Seeing Brandon, he motioned the two of them over. Shaking hands through the pressure suit, he said, I'm Dr. Kaito Suzuki. You are Brandon Olson, I presume? And this must be the famous Tasha Nagorski. Brandon answered, yes, sir, the one and only. That was quite a jolt we just took, but it didn't feel like any Earth or Mars quake I've ever been in. Is it the first you've experienced out here? Suzuki offered no more information than required at the moment. Yes, it was odd, and it's the first we felt on this trip. Fortunately, everyone is well, and so is our equipment. This is a most phenomenal sight, I must say. It was difficult to read the scientist's facial cues through the helmet visors, but Brandon continued. As you can see, the Sojourner 2 is back and in peak condition. The boring company engineers in conference with Mitsubishi had it restored in record time. Taking this as his due while trying to sound gracious, the biologist said, oh, yes, I'm sure they've done a splendid job. As you can see, we're doing our best to inspect everything before sundown. Feel free to look around. I'd like very much for you and Miss Nagorski here to join us for dinner aboard the William Gates. Is 8 p.m. good for you? Tasha gave Brandon a confused look before he answered. We'll be looking forward to it, Dr. Suzuki. I'm dying to hear what you've discovered. At this, the biologist trotted off to speak with another member of his team. Brandon signaled Tasha to go to a private channel. She said, friendly sort, isn't he? Didn't you think he was acting a bit squirrely? Brandon answered, well, I don't know the man, but I got the same vibe. At least he wasn't overtly hostile to our presence. So before he changes his mind, I'm going to poke around. You see that crawler up there? It looks like they've got a seismic thumper on a kind of trailer. How they managed to get it here in one piece, I'll never know. I want to speak to those folks about the quake. Nagorski and Olson walked up the gentle slope toward the geology group. On the way, Brandon said, something about this place looks familiar. As we walk, I'm seeing almost imperceptible troughs running north-south. Tasha was quiet, but a minute later said, I think I see it. What does it mean? Brandon replied, I'm not sure yet. I just need a second opinion. The light is all different, but the pattern is close to what I saw on Luna at an ice mining operation. Two people in pressure suits were up ahead. One was waving his arms in what looked like a heated discussion. The other caught a glimpse of Brandon, who could see his lips move before the woman next to him threw her hands up and walked away. Over the common channel, the man said, hello, you must be Brandon Olson, and this must be Tasha Nagorski. I'm Dr. Afram Ofori. We've been expecting you. All shook hands, and Brandon said, everything appears nominal, but real data comes from the field. I've checked out 4 others I've brought along. Tasha said, he was just admiring your thumper. Is that what you call it? The geologist looked pained. Yes, that is our thumper, as it is commonly called. We use it to generate sound waves for mapping underground features. Brandon then remembered where he had seen those parallel striations. It was on the moon at the bottom of a crater in the ice mining operation. Olson said, right. So you confirmed there's water and maybe CO2 buried out here? Ofori said, exactly. The deposit appears to be extensive. There's enough in these fields to merit piping back to the more settled areas. I'm confident. Brandon then said, we have an invitation to dine with Dr. Suzuki this evening. Will you be there? Appearing slightly relieved, Ofori said, yes, I will see you there, if you don't mind. We're still checking our equipment after that tremor. Doing their best to keep out of the way, Tasha and Brandon then examined the seismic testing and other equipment as it was put away. Tasha said, that guy is a bit jumpy as well. They're geologists, so maybe they know something we don't. Brandon said, I've seen those striations I mentioned on the moon. The ice there came from a homogeneous mixture of water and fine dust. There's no wind on Mars, but the smaller particles become charged, then move around due to electric field differences. Water and regolith accumulate over millions of years. Eventually, enough mass stacks up to press water and rock together. Where deposits on the moon didn't really break up, explosives were used. That's where I saw them. Tasha asked, so Brandon, are you saying the lunar deposits acted as one continuous mass like a glacier? The engineer responded, that's my pet theory. What it means I can't say. Tasha brought her dress Star Olympus coveralls, but opted not to wear them. Best not to antagonize anyone, she said to herself. Tasha and Brandon spent the rest of the afternoon setting up the seismometer in the Sojourner 2. Now they were entering the interior airlock doors of the William Gates. Dr. Suzuki said, welcome. We're a bit cramped for space, but I believe you know the way to the galley. Dr. Ofori asked, please, can I get anyone a drink, Tasha? What will you have? Tasha, knowing it was all powdered, said, I'll have a Cabernet Sauvignon, please. Brandon said, I'll have an ale, whatever you have. Dr. Suzuki said, after so much time out here, we're in for a treat in honor of our guest and the return of the Sojourner too. Instead of freeze-dried, we're having fresh, I mean unfrozen meat. Tasha hoped what their host meant by meat would be chicken or turkey, the only true livestock raised in the MUNIS compounds. The United Nations long ago had redefined insect proteins as meat and actually enforced it on Mars. Usually it was ground up and flavored like hamburger. The dinner continued with discussion of the meteor crater and what they might find. Safe topics common to MUNIS and the frontier were discussed. Brandon debated with himself whether he should bring up the afternoon quake and decided against it during a social dinner. A member of Dr. Suzuki's team interrupted the party during dessert. Dr. Suzuki, the patrol drones are picking up something rather strange to the west. I think you should have a look. Suzuki folded his napkin and set it on the table. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. This shouldn't take long. When he returned, he was shaking his head in wonder as he addressed the group. One of our drones has picked up something everyone should see, though I can't say I know what it is. Dr. Suzuki transferred the video feed to a large viewer at the end of the galley and took partial control of the drone. It was flying approximately 30 meters above the surface at about 4 kilometers per hour. Tasha said, that looks familiar in a couple of ways. The drone was flying along a fissure in the ice, maybe 5 meters wide. There was an eerie blue-green glow coming from the depths. Brandon said, telemetry indicates about 1.8 kilometers due west. Do we know how deep it is? Tasha directed her question to Dr. Ofori. I don't know about you, but that looks like a classic fault line. That glow is similar to what we found in the Olympus Mons cavern. Then to Suzuki, could we briefly shine some light in there? I'd like to see what the walls look like. Annoyed by Tasha's boldness, Dr. Suzuki turned on the floodlights. Dr. Ofori said, the break looks clean. There's little or no dust layer, so I'm guessing this opened up since last winter. Brandon asked, what about that shock we felt this afternoon? Could it be that new? Tasha spoke excitedly. The light has to be bioluminescent. I didn't see it near the surface, but I wouldn't expect that. Is there a way to gauge the depth? Ofori said, we could try. Can you kill the lights, Kaito? Thanks. We don't have any idea what the luminosity is, so we can't judge the depth that way. Kaito, do you have ultrasonic capability? Dr. Suzuki answered, yes, we have ultrasonic, LiDAR, and exceptional camera resolution. The geologist said, Kaito, let's concentrate on the next bright patch and see what we come up with. Suzuki soon zeroed in and dropped the drone to about a meter above the ground, spaced between two rims of the fissure. Using ultrasonic collision avoidance, he lowered the probe toward the brightest area. At first, the clear walls of the water and CO2 ice were a faint cobalt blue. As the drone descended, the light intensity increased, with blurred patches of new color appearing in greater intensity. Vertical cracks were noticeable. They appeared to have healed by networks of new crystal growth seeded by exposed glacial walls. Light intensity increased monotonically as the probe moved lower. Then all motion stopped. The exobiologist said, that's as low as I can go. The rift is just over a meter wide where the drone sits. There is horizontal displacement right below, blocking the way. From the surface, we're 38.3 meters down. Hold on. Suzuki moved his dessert tray and napkin aside, clearing the table below where he transferred the full suite of drone instrument controls. He cleared his throat as he resumed control of the gathering. There's an interesting spot. Let's get a gas sample. Firing a laser into the ice, the drone analyzed gases emerging from the cut. Okay, folks, I see water, carbon monoxide, CO2, methane, ethyl alcohol, and glucose. Good signs for life, but these drones aren't capable of scooping samples. We have equipment we can use, but not at this late hour. As coffee was being served, a shockwave similar to the afternoon quake, but with much less energy, rocked the science teams. Tasha asked, Dr. Ofori, are you sure it's safe to be out here? Since I've been on Mars, there's been quakes, but none as large or as often. Brandon was more to the point. I'm curious also about your seismic testing and methods. Were there any quakes before you began testing, not caused by the meteor itself? Tasha wished to slow down the questioning before Brandon got nasty. Suzuki hoped they wouldn't have to reveal too much. Tasha asked, Dr. Ofori, do you still have all of your geophones deployed? The geologist said, Yes, we do, Ms. Nagorski. Why do you ask? Tasha said, I'm not an expert as you or your team, but with all those devices, you're capable of mapping the fault lines, correct? Ofori had to admit, yes, that's fairly straightforward. Tasha continued, do you have such a map, or could you bring it up? At the very least, we don't want anyone falling into a crevasse. The geologist called up his files and moved them to the center of the dining table. A map appeared for this part of the Noctis Labyrinthus, with a marker indicating their encampment. He said, let me zoom into the area with the best data. Speaking to his AI, he said, show me the latest glacial map indicating the first and second level faults. Brandon noted, you see there, Tasha? Major fault lines parallel each other 5 or more kilometers north and south of this spot. Ofori fed in the coordinates from Dr. Suzuki's drone, and a marker appeared in one of the wider fissures. Dr. Ofori said, as you can see, the fault lines are deeper as we move west into the thicker areas. Still, nothing indicates a safety concern. If anything, stress has been relieved. Protocols for living and working on a glacier must be observed. Moreover, ice at cryogenic temperatures is harder than anything on Earth and significantly stronger. Tasha asked several significant questions without receiving definitive answers. Clearly, the presence of frontiersmen, especially she and Brandon, was to be tolerated at best. Brandon said, Tasha, these folks have a lot to do, so let's not keep them up all night drawing. We'll work out of the Sojourner in the meantime. They said goodnight to their hosts, donned their pressure suits, and headed for the other crawler. The next morning, Tasha, Susan, and Brandon awoke, dressed, and made their way to the galley of the Sojourner 2. No one else was aboard. As Brandon looked through the pantry for something palatable, Tasha and Susan restocked the coffee maker and satisfied themselves with oatmeal and jam. Brandon brought his heated pancakes to the table and called up the camera located on a retractable 15-foot mast at the back of the rig. Tasha said, what's that look on your face, Brandon? You seem confused. Brandon replied, confused is only the beginning. Did Dr. Suzuki say anything about moving to another site? The Bill Gates is gone, habitat pods and all. Riley scanned through the vehicle log. It says here that I'm now assigned as driver for the Sojourner 2. The rest of MUNIS personnel have been dispersed to other vehicles. The Bill Gates left 2 hours ago, heading for the crevasse we saw last night. Brandon asked, could we see the positions of each vehicle? Riley displayed an area map in the galley tabletop viewer. Tasha asked, do we have the survey map from last night? Riley looked through the logs and said, yes, it's right here. I'll do an overlay. Brandon said, they made good time. Too good for someone I just trained. Tasha responded, training is one thing, but a Nobel Prize nominee cracking the whip is another. Could Suzuki be that threatened by her presence? Susan said, They weren't exactly eager for a free exchange of ideas last night. You're thinking they raced up there to make sure you weren't horning in on some great discovery? Tasha took a long swig of her coffee. I don't know what the motivation is, but it's as good a reason as any. Dr. Suzuki is leading this group. We still don't know if Thomas was acting in his name, Dr. Suzuki, or his aunt's with his little stunt. Certainly poor decisions are being made here. Dr. Ofori could not have mapped fault lines over such a wide area using only thumpers. He needed something more powerful. The map we saw was only the result of the tremors we felt. Brandon asked, are you implying that those faults were the result of blast waves? As Brandon took the last bite of his pancakes, Tasha said, from what little I've seen, yeah, I'm basing it on how clean that crevasse was, the size, and how extensive the faults were. No one has ever been in this area before. Those cracks can't be natural. After billions of years, they show up just as Suzuki's team arrives. Brandon, did you say Ares launch might have access to SecMed? Brandon answered, they might. On a priority UN project, I doubt there's anything they couldn't get, including nukes. Chapter 24, The Edge. Susan and Tasha were each on their second 20-ounce coffee. Tasha asked, so where was Brandon off to this morning? Riley replied, finding his MUNIS trainees to go over idiosyncrasies of the crawlers. Tasha continued monitoring the seismic map and progress of the William Gates, then said, I don't suppose any of them went with Dr. Suzuki. I bet they shot out of here at first light. Riley replied, no, the log assignments for the drivers is to stay here and work with Brandon before duty with a particular crawler. I guess they figured since I came out here with him, my training is sufficient. Tasha said, look, they're almost to the crevasse. Brandon returned for lunch to find Tasha catching up on her Star Olympus emails. She remarked, Oli says they found the discrepancies in the shuttle thrust parameters. Let's hope so. I wouldn't want our passengers to repeat that maiden flight. Brandon, looking closely at the label of a freeze-dried Hot Pocket, checking for bug meat, asked, any word from Suzuki's team? Tasha answered, not much. A grad student texted Riley about an ROV they'd lowered, but with no details. He's probably got everyone sworn to secrecy. My probing will only jack up his paranoia. Brandon was on his second Hot Pocket when Tasha asked, how can you eat those things? Her friend said, you know me, the time it takes to prepare something is a big factor. Just then the Sojourner 2's alarm sounded, while the voice of the crawler's AI synced with a message appearing on all visible displays. Red alert, transponder down, vehicle 03-119, William Gates, transponder signal loss, last known coordinates. Tasha said, oh, perfect. What do you think they've gotten themselves into now? Brandon said, well, there's one thing we can be pretty sure about. Riley asked, and that is? Tasha replied for Brandon, one thing we could be confident that there's no emergency plan. Every group up here seems to be doing their own thing. Instinctively, Susan, Brandon, and Tasha took stock of their equipment, where it was stowed, and locations for crawlers with working transponders. Tasha opened the common channel. To all members of the expedition, by now you all know we've lost track of the William Gates. The Sojourner 2 is still packed up, so we're proceeding toward her last known location. We request the Curie follow as soon as possible. We're moving now as time may be a factor. Surprised by the lack of immediate protest, Tasha said, okay, boys and girls, let's get going. Brandon? What was the last location? Brandon replied, 4.3 kilometers north, 85 degrees, 10 minutes west. Brandon said, considering the rifts we've mapped and the many possible that aren't. We should be in crawl mode full time. Tasha said, that makes sense. I'll send up a drone to scout ahead. There may be visible features to give away their positions. Tasha had to admire the way Riley handled this rig. With the drone high enough, she could barely discern Sojourner Two's movements from those of a garden spider. Tasha said, the terrain is getting more rugged. If they're already there, they must have taken a different route. I'll send another drone to their last position. I should have thought of that half an hour ago, Riley said. We should send them both, then wait here to see if the second drone could pick up their tracks and follow them back. It'll be faster than feeling our way alone. 10 minutes later, the two drones hovered near the crevasse explored the night before. Tasha said, I don't see any sign of them. There are wheel tracks 60 yards to this side of the marker, but then I lose them in the rocks. I'm going to put both drones into a search pattern centered on the target location. The galley viewer is split into two screens, one for each drone, plus an inlay showing both on top of the search pattern. Each drone rastered back and forth across the crevasse to points 60 yards either side of the chasm. A few minutes later, Brandon said, can we stop the pattern and back up? Tasha replied, sure. Did you see something? Brandon was looking intently at the drone number 2 feed. Pointing at the display, he said, there, stop. You see there? This group of rocks look like they've been dragged. There are marks perpendicular to the edge. Riley said, I see them. Several rocks were scooped along and fell into the pit. Tasha said, that doesn't look good. Let's see if we can relay our comms through the drone. William Gates, this is Sojourner 2. Are you reading? The reply was faint. This is William Gates. We read you. Signal, faint. Antenna, damaged. Over. Tasha asked, what is your condition? Dr. Suzuki answered, we're in crevasse approximately 17 meters. All aboard and uninjured. So far, no damage to life. Systems. Battery is 81%. Sensor logs indicate that the legs extended to brake, fall, wedges sideways between, out. Tasha said, we lost your transponder signals, so set out to look for you. We ran into very rugged terrain. Please send us a copy of your route and we'll follow. Changing to multiple burst transmission. Out. Brandon, do you have any advice for them before we get there? In anticipation, Brandon was already typing a list of procedures and options for the William Gates. I'm on it. This should be a list of the most important items. It's on the clipboard there. Tasha sent the list on its own and verified receipt. Brandon said, the first items are to make sure they don't slip too far. If the legs are forming a wedge, that won't be reliable. The AI should set anchors where needed. There's a coiled auxiliary antenna. One of their microcrawlers could extend it to the surface. As she backed up the crawler, Riley said, I have the Gates route from our drone, or most of it. We'll see if the AI fills in the missing pieces. The Sojourner soon followed Dr. Suzuki's tracks toward the crevasse. Soon the crawler was almost on top of an indicated fault. Riley stopped the vehicle and asked, okay, Brandon, what do we do here? Do we just walk across and hope for the best? He thought briefly, then said, you both know that spiders can jump many times their body length, right? Tasha laughed. Are you serious? You think that's the best solution? Brandon answered, these rigs can't jump as far as a spider can, but many times the body length, with the legs taking the shock. As with people, it helps to have a running start. Riley said, please, Brandon, maybe you should take the driver's seat. Olson said, That won't be necessary. I'll show you how to program the jump. Then we'll strap in and do it. Tasha had been around Brandon long enough to know he wasn't a daredevil, so strapped in and said no more. He had the AI do a couple of calculations based on weight, balance, and lifting capacity as starting points. Then the computer did the rest. Looking at the viewer, Tasha asked, "What are those markers?" "The start and jump points?" Brandon said, "Yes. Okay, Riley. Take us to the starting line." After lining up to the computer markers, Susan said, "Go." Tasha had never gone so fast in this type of vehicle. She expected the shock and bounce of horseback riding, but this motion was smooth and fluid. Briefly, they were airborne, rocking slightly from side to side before landing softly. Riley said, "That was fun. If our agenda wasn't more important, I could do that all day." Tasha looked at Brandon and smiled. "Impressive." He said, "Hey, it's not like I invented it. I did a lot of research on these machines before they were shanghaied by the UN. The ground on the other side was smoother, and soon the rescue party arrived at the next crevasse." Tasha said, "Susan, there's our drone off to the right, sitting near the edge on this side." Riley said, "Got it. I'll just move us up a little closer." Tasha said, "Stay back at least 10 meters from the rim. We don't know how stable this stuff is." Brandon said, "I don't see the auxiliary antenna. Either they didn't fully get the message, or they don't know how." "Tasha, I'd like to send one of our mini crawlers in to check things out." She answered, "You got it. Let's see what these things can do." Brandon took control of the mini crawler and it jumped off the main deck of the Sojourner 2 onto the ground. They watched as it walked over near where the drone was parked. Tasha brought up the display for the mini crawler. Text indicated, "Drilling for anchor bolts," Brandon said. "We're going to drop it in there for a closer look." Next, the display said, "Attaching descent line attached." Brandon moved the crawler up to the edge and dropped the front two legs down into the vertical slope. The display said, "Unreeling anchor line, 10 centimeters per second." The display now gave a view straight down into the crevasse, getting darker as the crawler moved lower. Bright LEDs lit the chasm as the camera panned in search of the Bill Gates. Tasha said, "Is that a leg there to the left?" Brandon said, "That's what it looks like. Let's see if we can get any traction." Lucky for us, we're on the foot wall of this fault. The angle is very steep, but there should be enough to work with. The display said, "Traction spurs engaged, tensile force decreasing." Tasha asked, "Does that mean some of the weight is off the spinneret, transferred to the legs?" Olson answered, "Exactly. Now we should be able to move laterally along the wall." As the crawler inched left, two larger legs of the Bill Gates became visible. The two legs were adjacent on the right side of the vehicle, but were wedged on opposite sides of the crevasse. Once Brandon had the crawler close enough, he grabbed onto one of the legs. Inching toward the chassis, he then jumped onto the central cabin. Tasha asked, "Are you going for the antenna?" Brandon nodded yes. He brought up a schematic of the crawler indicating its goal. The display showed a ring labeled AUX-ANT on the top right-hand side of the rig. Brandon brought the mini crawler along the outside of the cabin. A leg containing a pincer clutched the ring, pulling it toward its head, then locking the ring underneath itself. The display indicated auxiliary antenna ring secured, taking up spinneret cable slack, spinneret tension increasing. Tasha said, "Looks like you have the fish on the line. Time to reel him in, eh?" Brandon smiled. "Something like that. Let's hope there's no damage to the antenna spool." The display showed a view from the front of the mini crawler down the auxiliary antenna line toward the receding William Gates. Tasha heard crackling over the comms as the wire neared the surface. "I don't hear anyone yet, but at least it's on," she said. Brandon answered, Pulling the cable free should fire an indicator letting them know it's now active. Once they establish communication, they'll switch off the primary. Sojourner 2, this is William Gates. Are you receiving? Somehow we're on the auxiliary antenna. Over. Tasha answered. William Gates acknowledged. This is Sojourner 2. We read you. We pulled up your antenna and it's now anchored to the surface. Out. Dr. Suzuki replied, you are loud and clear now, but there's been more slippage since last contact. Brandon lowered the mini-crawler into the depths once more. Tasha said, Dr. Suzuki, Brandon has one of our mini-crawlers coming down for a more complete picture. Can you put systems information online so we can get that data as well? Suzuki had great difficulty being rescued by Tasha Nagorski and friends. Swallowing his pride, he said, I'll send you the drive and sensor telemetry if that's what you're looking for. Over. Brandon made a driving motion to Tasha, who said, we also need motor and utility control. The biologist said, can't you just tell the driver what to do directly? Brandon raised his hands and shook his head. Patiently, Tasha explained, it's really better if he has tactile feedback and direct control. One person's reaction time is less than two. Knowing that Tasha was right the whole time, Suzuki said, very well, control is now authorized. Brandon had been looking closely through the mini-crawler's eyes. He grabbed an e-ink tablet and scratched, stall for time, there's something we need to check out. Tasha said, Brandon's looking over your system and into the database. In the long run, it will speed things up. Over. Suzuki said, standing by. With the comms channel closed, Tasha asked, what gives, Brandon? He said, I was giving their vehicle once and twice over looking for damage and found something interesting. He slid the mini-crawler's video stream back several minutes and let it play. Tasha said, what am I looking at? Brandon turned on the cursor's red pen, waited, then stopped the video. He expanded the lower left corner to enhance resolution. He drew a circle around a loose package and asked, what do you see there? Tasha expanded the view even more. She said, it looks like Sekhmet to me. Tasha said, from what I know about that stuff, it's pretty stable. Only shock or very high pressure will set it off. Brandon answered, that's right. The stuff still strapped to gates could sit there until doomsday, but we don't know how much is down there. I see 4 packages loosely bound to their rig. The thing is, just as many may have fallen into the abyss. Tasha said, we can't leave loose packets in netting where they could spill out. We have to grab it before raising the crawler. Brandon said, right, first things first. Let's just hope we don't have any more slides, or we may never go home. Brandon wrote a few talking points in e-ink for Tasha to keep their subjects occupied. Brandon was working the 2 problems simultaneously. Tasha said, first, we're going to make sure you're anchored to the walls. Right now it is only the position of the legs holding you where you are. Brandon found 2 legs for his best candidates and started drilling anchor points. He then deployed a sample bag from the mini-crawler and attached it to the cargo webbing. With 6 legs firmly planted on the gate's hull, he slowly grabbed a Sekhmet package with pincers mounted on the front 2 legs. One leg lifted off the hull to hold open the bag. Scooting the package to the edge, he held his breath and let it drop. Sensors on the leg holding the bag registered a weight increase. Chapter 25, Tightrope. Tasha said, until we can figure out the best way to move, the gates should be well anchored. It looks like the drill holes for the pitons are almost done. Tasha watched as Brandon went for the second packet. He pinned it to the hull of the gates with one leg, then grabbed it on each side with 2 others. Moving all 3, he slid it toward the bag held open by the first packet. Sliding it in more than 50%, he let it drop the rest of the way. Returning to the gates problem, he attached the 2 legs to the 2 pitons and puzzled over the positions of the legs. He told the AI to disentangle them in the best way for walking on one or both surfaces with the goal of moving the vehicle upward. Tasha said, "We're going to try to get you walking, but remember, this is a baby with 8 legs rather than 2. The AI moved the legs in several different ways before settling on a position. Spiked cleats were deployed for each leg. Tools came out to gauge the consistency of the ice in the walls. Brandon used the time to figure out how to go after the last 2 packets. They were deeper into the cargo netting, but still vulnerable since they were not packed as tightly. Tasha watched as he pushed into the netting to separate the 2 packets. Little by little, he moved the packet closer to the rip in the netting. When a corner was exposed, he gripped it with a claw before pushing it out. He gripped the center of the packet when it was exposed. When most of it was free, he pushed it toward the collection bag and dropped it in. Tasha wondered why Brandon didn't just cut the netting and bring everything up in 2 bags, but she wasn't about to interrupt. Knowing Brandon needed more time, Tasha said, "Dr. Suzuki, we're just making sure we know the strength of the ice before moving further. Please stand by." Brandon was on the last packet, was almost out of the netting and moving toward the collection bag. Brandon pressed the packet harder against the hull and tried to pull free of the netting, but the packet slipped. Falling toward the collection bag, it flipped and hit the edge of it, but fell on the outside. Tasha braced herself, even though she knew nothing would happen right this minute. She saw Brandon silently swear, then pull himself together. He made sure the bag was secured to the spider with 2 more legs and gave the command to retract the suspending line. Brandon took a deep breath, then gave commands to the mini-crawler to bring the bag back to the Sojourner 2's pass-through airlock. With that accomplished, he sent it back into the crevasse to act as another set of eyes. Soon, he and AI were feeling out the first steps upward for the William Gates. He drilled, planted a piton, then attached a foot. It was painstaking and time-consuming, but it was working. Sometimes the crawler was pointed straight up, and other times it was sideways, like a crab. Tasha said, "Dr. Suzuki, it looks like the best ice is along the head fault on the opposite side. You're in for a bit of an upside down." It dawned on Tasha that Brandon's method of retrieving the sekhmet will leave no clue that it was they who took it. Clean cuts in the cargo netting would remove all doubt in Dr. Suzuki's mind as to where it went. For now, he could only wonder. Brandon and the AI had the gates just a few meters from the top. He was using more anchors now since he was sitting backward at a 15-degree angle. Tasha didn't have to entertain Dr. Suzuki since they were all concentrating on getting the vehicle over the edge. The truth was, they were much safer now than when they were found. The problem was how to get them across. Brandon said, "The gap is too great to try jumping. Even if it wasn't, they'd never go for it." Tasha answered, "You said that one cable and anchor could hold the entire vehicle, right?" Brandon said, "That's true, but I prefer a lot of insurance." Tasha said, "Why don't we build a bridge then?" Brandon wasn't sure what she was talking about. "Build a bridge out of what? We're out here in the middle of nowhere." Tasha clucked her tongue and said, "We'll make a bridge out of 2 cables. We'll anchor them on each side, and the Bill Gates can grip them as she walks across the gap. It's like 2 parallel tight ropes, only she can actually grip the rope. We can anchor 2 of the spinneret lines for even more insurance." With the Bill Gates safely ensconced on the opposite side of the void, Brandon and Tasha laid out the plan for Dr. Suzuki et al. He wasn't pleased about it, but it was better than swinging across the gap on 2 cables in a Martian version of Tarzan. He preferred to wait until the next day, as it was nearly sunset. Earlier, the biologist looked over the vehicle for damage. He noticed the broken antenna, the torn netting, and other minor scuffs. She was in surprisingly good shape. The fact that half of his explosives were missing was disturbing. He didn't really have a reason for bringing them, other than haste. He'd browbeaten Ofori into using them and paid off in the discovery of more bioluminescent organisms. If he could only get to them, he needed to make a mark out here. Perhaps he could open things up in the same way as the meteor had. Toward evening, the Curie arrived, and the three groups settled down for the evening. All were parked well away from the edge of the chasm, on Tasha's suggestion. Around 2 a.m., Tasha felt a prolonged shudder. Quickly, she pulled up her viewer and the transponder map. Everyone was still there and no emergency messages. She went back to sleep, and 40 minutes later, she felt another. Knowing there'd be no sleep for a while, she went to the galley. Brandon was already there, making hot chocolate, which he finished and handed to her. Thanks, she said. Those tremors got you nervous too? He smiled and said, nervous has to be the understatement of the year. What the hell are we doing out here with these yahoos anyway? We can't babysit them forever. Tasha said, I know. We have to get that rig across and get the hell out of here. I didn't come all this way to become a Martian popsicle. Brandon said, if you warned Dr. Suzuki, do you think he would listen to you? Or is he just too arrogant to listen to anyone? Tasha said, now that you have the proof, what's the best way to proceed? The man is a Nobel Prize nominee. He won't want to lose face over such a bonehead play. He'll just deny everything, won't he? Brandon answered, I've sent all the video of the retrieval to 3 different repositories under my control. Should we send it to Inoue? We still don't have any proof Suzuki or Safford was involved in the bombing, but the implication is there. Tasha said, let's not mix the 2 cases. I don't like the way these people use innuendo, and I'm not going to adopt those tactics. We have a good case that high-power explosives were used on this glacier and on our tracks, but we can't link the 2 right now. Brandon responded, one way or another, we have to get them across and evacuate this glacier. I don't like this seismic activity. Whether Suzuki and Ofori started it or not, we have an even bigger problem. 4 or 5 packets of Sekhmet are at the bottom of the crevasse. We've crossed 7 or 8 kilometers from the front of this glacier, and who knows how many tens of hundreds of kilometers of ice are behind us. If it breaks loose, there's a good chance one of those packets will detonate, and then all the rest. Brandon brought his hot chocolate to the table and said, so what do you think we should do? Tasha said, I say we work swiftly but carefully to bring the Bill Gates across, then request a private meeting with Dr. Suzuki. Perhaps if we give him a way to save face regarding evacuation, he'll take us up on it. Brandon said, that sounds like an offer he won't be able to refuse. Cheers. The next morning, Tasha, Brandon, and Susan were up early. They'd solidly anchored 2 cables on their side of the chasm. The reactor crawler, Curie, was connected by a conduit to the Sojourner 2, recharging her batteries. Dr. Suzuki and 2 men came out in pressure suits, and he directed them to fire a grappling hook across the gap attached to a spinneret. Tasha and Brandon secured the ends of the heavy cables to the hook to be pulled back across. Brandon had given them the spacing and method for securing their side of the cables for crossing. He'd assured them all would be safe riding in the vehicle. The William Gates moved onto the cables while on the ground and walked with foot pads to the inside. Once a leg was over the gap, the claws took over and hooked around the cable. The center of mass was kept low for stability. Tasha said, she's doing well, slowly but surely. Brandon was doing very little, as the AI had few options other than to inch toward the other side. The Gates was over the chasm by 2 body lengths when the next tremor hit. The crawler was hanging on with every foot, but shaken quite violently for about 6 seconds. Brandon checked the anchors on his side, and they still looked good. Better to get this over, he thought. Before the Gates stopped bouncing, he dialed up the pace for the AI. Tasha said, everyone okay in there? Dr. Suzuki was terribly frightened, but lied. We are all well. Let's continue. With the first steps of the Bill Gates onto the near side, another aftershock hit. The AI had already determined to stop moving with such disruptions. The last two legs scrambled onto the ice sheet, and the vehicle moved away from the gap. Quickly, Brandon, Susan, and Tasha began unhooking and winding up cables, putting away stakes, pitons, and other paraphernalia. Tasha then sent a text to the biologist. Dr. Suzuki, it's probably best that everyone take a breather for an hour. Then Brandon and I would like to meet with you privately in the Sojourner for an important discussion. Let's say 11 a.m. After 15 minutes, she received a reply. Yes, I will meet you. The researcher appeared in the airlock precisely at 11. His annoyance was evident, but they just pulled his ass out of the fire. It was a hassle getting in and out of a pressure suit for a conference he expected to be short and meaningless. Nevertheless, he did his best to be cordial. Brandon said, "We can talk in the galley. Would you like some tea, coffee?" Suzuki said, "Tea, please, or the closest facsimile." Tasha rewarmed her hot chocolate. Brandon served the tea, and they all sat down. Tasha said, "Dr. Suzuki, I don't know what your opinion of me is, or Brandon, but this expedition of yours must be cut short. We need to remove everyone from this ice sheet in a quick, orderly fashion." Brandon could see the biologist's face flush red with anger and braced himself. He added, "The increasing seismic activity should tell you it's unstable, but that's not all." Then Suzuki lost it. "Young man, you cannot come out here barking orders at me. I'm Dr. Kaito Suzuki. I'm the leader of this expedition. It has nothing to do with you and your choo-choo trains. It has nothing to do with you at all. I and my crew are exceedingly grateful with your assistance in getting us free of the crevasse. But this is too much." Turning to Tasha, he said, "Or is it just jealousy now that we've found what appears to be life similar to that on Olympus Mons? You can't stand sharing the spotlight with some actual scientists." Tasha didn't take the bait. She just said, "Dr. Suzuki, we know about the explosives, the SecMet you were carrying." Brandon queued up video from the day before, clearly showing the SecMet packages attached to the hull of the William Gates. Tasha said, "Doctor, this is what we're talking about. You see 2 packets inside the ripped cargo netting. We don't know how much you were carrying, so we don't know how much was lost overboard. Are you beginning to see the picture?" Tasha sensed Suzuki was trying to maintain a front as he said, "That's it? That's it. That's all we had left." Brandon said, "Come now, doctor. Are you standing by that statement? Or we can view more of the record." Kaito Suzuki made a career of bullying graduates, postdocs, and seasoned professors. He only scowled and said, "We both know that video is easy to fake." Brandon reached backward to the pantry and pulled something free. Holding up a SecMet package, he asked, "Doctor, would you like to try again?" Tasha crewed the crawler video and played it from beginning to end, then said, "Brandon did his very best to pull the remaining charges off your crawler. We believe our loss estimates are good, even accounting for the charges Dr. Ofori's team deployed." "That's right. Other seismograph data indicate powerful explosives were used at the end of this survey, but that's circumstantial." The exobiologist was running out of cards to play, replying, "So what? This is important work we're doing out here. As for the explosives, I have UN authorization, so it isn't your concern." Seeing just how stubborn the scientist was, Tasha said, "Dr. Suzuki, do you want to be known as a great scientist or a bumbling mass murderer?" Brandon held a forefinger to his lips and said, "Calm down there, Kaito. Let her continue." Tasha went on, "You've seen the increased activity. The last soundings by Dr. Ofori must have broken something loose. We're at the end of a glacier where the ice is likely to calve or rearrange. Fissures could slam shut with hundreds of tons behind them, and your explosives at a narrow point of a deep chasm. Is that clear enough for you?" Dr. Suzuki was sweating now and slightly slumped in his chair, clearly broken. Tasha said, "You need to get your people organized. Give them any story you like. Tell them the glacier is unstable and you're not taking any chances. That's more true than they'll ever know. Get everyone away safely, and no one needs to see that video. Take a few minutes to collect your thoughts. Tasha handed Brandon her cup and asked, "More hot chocolate, please?" Brandon refreshed everyone's drinks, including tea for Dr. Suzuki, who said, "Okay, I'm ready." Tasha was impressed and a little unnerved by how Suzuki controlled his voice and facial expression with such ease. Scientists at his level were also politicians. "Ladies and gentlemen, after long thought and deep regret of calling an end to our expedition, the increased seismic activity has become troublesome. Until we have more data on the stability of the glacier, I've determined caution to be our best response. As of now, we are evacuating the ice in an orderly fashion. We're to travel due east toward the leading edge and then to the current end of the Ares launch tracks.